Tale Podcast, how stories shape and change our lives. Thank you for joining me once again on this 5th episode of my introductory series on learning more about how we can engage with and orient ourselves towards stories in meaningful and healing ways. Today I'm going to talk about the tension of the energy between opposites, as well as introduce the mythical motif of the Trickster and the important role that Trickster plays in our lives. Growing up as a kid, as I did in the Midwest, I'll have to admit that most of the time I felt pretty bored. There wasn't much to do in a small Midwestern town, and the landscape itself didn't lend much or offer much to intrigue my own senses, which actually, in hindsight, proved to be a perfect backdrop for me to cultivate a very wild and active imagination. And it was there in my imagination that I found I could create energy and connect with powerful symbols and images that resonated with my soul. Art, music, prose, and poetry, these were all significant contributors to that building wild landscape of my very young soul. And they all taught me how to be curious about so many things that lay beyond the boundaries of my home and beyond my own experience. One thing that the landscape of the Midwest did have to offer me, that did intrigue my senses and heightened my anticipation, were the presence of large supercell thunderstorms that would roll across the plains and cornfields from west to east, particularly during the springtime. Hearing the low rumbles of thunder off in the distance, signaling the advent of an oncoming storm, so it always almost instantly trigger my anticipation and my imagination. It's worth noting here how thunderstorms are created. It's the combination or this clash of cold, dry air mixed with warm, moist air all coming together, which creates an energy mass that begins to build and build and build until it turns into a full-fledged thunderstorm. And then the thunderstorm itself becomes a swirling energy of movement within itself, which also travels. And as it travels, it interacts with its environment in ways that will either strengthen or weaken it, depending on tons and tons of different variables. So here we see that something which requires energy and motion is created by the relationship of many different things coming together, working together, interacting and colliding with each other to create an organization, the organization of one giant thing itself that acts and reacts within its own environment. But in order for something new to be created, other smaller contained systems have to be disrupted by something new or foreign to its organizational composition. So, according to the law of thermodynamic equilibrium, stating there is no tendency for the state of a closed system to change spontaneously. And according to systems theory, all closed systems naturally seek a state of equilibrium in which entropy is at a maximum state, leaving no more energy left to move, change, or transform. It takes an external source of energy to be introduced into that existing system to stimulate movement and change, which then itself creates a new form of energy, giving it the impetus to further change and transform into something else or something new. So in other words, for any kind of change to occur, something new has to show up and disrupt what's already there. So I know that's getting into perhaps the weeds a bit, but I think these observations have a lot to teach us about our own individual psyches because they act that way. They reflect these apparent laws of nature as we have observed them so far. We have parts of the psyche that are designed to preserve homeostasis, principally the human ego. Alternately, we have whatever parts of ourselves that our egos have rejected, stored deep down in what we have called the human shadow or the unconscious. The inner impetus for transformation, growth, change, even healing to occur come primarily from this place, this shadowy place within the human psyche, those parts of ourselves we don't want to see or we have learned to ignore, decided maybe are irrelevant in some way. A necessary tension that exists between the waking parts of us, which are seeking that sense of homeostasis, and the sleeping parts of us, perhaps looking to disrupt any status quo that has rejected them. And it is in this tension we perceive the experience then of opposites. It seems that our ability to grow, change, transform, and evolve, even heal our own wounds, requires the capacity on our part to have our internal equilibriums disrupted in some way. Some form of tension and conflict then are necessary for us to experience when it is time for some movement or some change to happen in our lives. And some form of discomfort is going to accompany that initiatory stimulus out of a state of equilibrium and into a state of flux, change, or chaos. So understanding the given presence of this primal tension within us is important. First, so we know how to normalize it as almost a pre-existing condition for change to occur in our own lives. And then secondly, to give ourselves permission to learn what our job is from there. Going about the process of healing wounds, letting go of old stories about ourselves, and making room for new stories and new maps of the soul to emerge requires a transformation process. Which means we need to develop a helpful way to learn how to engage with and manage conflict within ourselves. So it is here that I would like to introduce the archetypal motif of the trickster. Now, trickster can mean many different things depending on the culture in which it is imagined and experienced. But one quality or trait that all tricksters have in common is that they are disruptors. In a previous episode, I stated that one of the ego's primary functions is to be the supreme protector of our internal status quo. As such, it remains very vigilant in its task, and because it's so good at its job, it occasionally needs to be tricked or hoodwinked into letting down its guard long enough for something new or something different to slip through the door. Trickster's good at disrupting or even stealing something from us that we have decided feels pretty vital to our own well-being in some way. And it's really not until we become aware of the loss or distraught enough about it that we consent to go on a journey out of our comfort zones because we're already uncomfortable. Those have already been disrupted outside of a state of equilibrium, which may have felt completely destroyed, to then go on a journey to get back what we feel we have lost. Tricksters in different stories can take on different roles that can range anywhere between benign mischief makers, typically in the form of an animal, all the way to frightening creatures or monsters that we are likely to regard as very evil, threatening, frightening, etc. In either case, none of us are likely to regard Trickster as a welcome presence in our lives. We're far more likely to regard it as an adversary, and we're all doing our best to avoid or outwit Trickster if we can. Disruptions in our lives are always troublesome. They're certainly uncomfortable. And while some can remain not much more than that, others can be very devastating and traumatic, leaving us with the feeling that our lives have been forever changed in some significant way, and that there really is no going back or returning to the way things were before. And in these states of chaos and confusion, we're feeling a lot of things all at once. State of loss, confusion, grief, anger, bewilderment. It's not uncommon for any of us to develop various states of depression and anxiety, particularly when trauma is involved. Our entire sense of self, or at least the self as we once knew it, has been broken apart and shattered. Faced with a moment in our lives where suddenly we're now being forced to try to make sense out of something that makes no sense, something that has happened to us, and trying then to figure out how we're supposed to pick up the scattered pieces of our lives where everything that we thought was permanent and reliable, or we believed to be true or taken for granted, is now all shot to hell and all up for grabs. This is one of the most painful and isolating experiences a person can ever have. In one moment, you had that reliable map and a clear direction to go and a clear purpose. And in the next minute, the map is gone, the purpose is gone, the terrain has been forever altered. Those, of course, are the really significant and monumental disruptions. And they tend to be initiated by external events, things that have happened to us in our lives. Not all disruptions, however, are painful or traumatic. Sometimes an internal disruption is taking place, where a shadow part of us has decided to bug us, and bug us even more until it is successful at getting our attention. Sometimes we can experience that in noticing that our lives, perhaps, are feeling a little stale or stagnant in some way that we can't quite put our finger on. Sometimes that in itself can provoke an increased experience of stress or anxiety. Other times it can show up as a depression. Places where we used to have a lot of drive and energy and ambition suddenly feel a little empty to us, and we begin to notice that. And again, moments like these can and will be extremely unnerving to us. Perhaps, for instance, we've worked very, very hard, put in a lot of time, energy, and effort, even sacrifice, to achieve a vision of who we wanted to be and what we wanted to be doing, only to discover after we got there that things aren't as fulfilling and satisfying or rewarding as we hoped they'd be. These transitions we end up taking in life are all journeys out of some form of innocence and into new knowledge or awareness. And the funny thing about that kind of journey is that it's a one-way ticket. In other words, there is no going back into innocence. Once we know something, we cannot unknow it. We can choose, and we do often choose to practice the art of denial, but once innocence is lost, it's lost forever. Now, denial itself is a protective mechanism. As such, we ought not to be too quick to judge it, particularly since we have all used it at one point or many in our lives to try and cope with various levels of our own discomfort and confusion. Perhaps this coping strategy helps to give us some room and some time to learn how to accept our situation and maybe just develop a little bit of resilience before we learn how to take a closer look at what's happened and try to pick ourselves up and begin moving again. And in this sense, we can honor the coping mechanism of denial insofar as it has provided us with some form of temporary distance and shelter from an overwhelming discomfort. Staying in stuck places too long, however, renders a cost. And the price we can end up paying if we stay stuck for too long is to become so distant from ourselves, so disconnected from ourselves, that eventually we run the risk of becoming disconnected from others, becoming disconnected from the world, and in extreme cases, maybe even reality itself. Whatever sense of safety or security we were initially able to replicate for ourselves in a state of stuckness, it doesn't last. And eventually those feelings and sensations of shelter and safety transform into something else, usually a mounting discomfort, a sense of edginess, increased stress and irritability and anxiety. So, as we can see, there are a number of different ways that transformation can be initiated in our lives, both externally and internally. And regardless of whatever the circumstances were that started that for us, in the aftermath, our task is always to learn how to get up again somehow. And whether we choose to take a new path or a journey in our lives of our own accord, or whether we have been kicked out of the proverbial gardens of our own innocence and sense of security unwillingly, or perhaps we simply needed to be tricked into it, it really doesn't matter all that much. The what or even the why of what has happened to us is not what becomes the most important thing. The most important thing becomes the how we choose to move forward. And that decision is always and ever entirely up to us. While I think it can sometimes be a valuable question to ask ourselves, what have I learned by going through this process? That can easily become the wrong question to ask if it leads us to think that the painful thing that did happen to us was somehow a quote-unquote sneakily cloaked good thing in disguise. We are not somehow supposed to become grateful or happy that we have been hurt, wounded, traumatized, abused, abandoned, or had our very lives shattered. That would be disingenuous and not telling the truth about how these things have actually made us feel and impacted us. And I would encourage my listeners to be wary of anyone who might want to come around suggesting this idea, trying to reframe our devastations in our lives as quote-unquote blessings in disguise. Not only is that not true, it's a particularly insidious form of emotional manipulation and gaslighting. Whatever the gift is, it is never the wound itself. The gift, or at least the potential gift, can only be found in the aftermath when we're trying to pick up the pieces of our lives somehow. And here we must acknowledge that not everybody's able to do that. For many people, there are wounds and traumas that can run so deep that they are just never able to fully recover from them. And I think we do well to monitor our own internal judgments about folks in such places for those of us who are standing on the other side of that. And instead maybe dig a little bit deeper into our own internal wells of compassion. How we each learn to tend to our wounds and go about any process of finding healing, that's unique to every person. And there's no one right way to do it. Sometimes the process of healing simply means that we learn to love ourselves just a little bit more today than we were able to yesterday. There's no race to be won here, no imagined prize at the end. Our journeys are our own, and they take whatever amount of time they're going to take. And we practice kindness with ourselves to the extent that we learn how to quiet down whatever internal judgments or judgment stories are floating around in our heads that are accusing us somehow of not having it all figured out yet, as though we should have. There are gifts on the other side of disruption. The thing is, they're not usually the gifts we are expecting or hoping for. But if we can take the time and the space to hear them out just a little, we might discover that they have the potential to transform and even heal our lives in ways we never could have possibly imagined. In the vulnerability of brokenness, we may now have some access to those hidden parts of ourselves that we safely stored away that we never could or would allow ourselves to see before. Sometimes one of the gifts is a new lens with which to look at ourselves and even look back on our lives differently. A lens that provides perhaps a more merciful, more compassionate, even more redemptive story about us than we were carrying around and living with at the time. And that in and of itself can be a wonderful gift and moment of healing. So I want to come back to Trickster for a moment. And as far as Trickster goes, there's no moral implication that we should be attaching to it in terms of how we should or shouldn't feel about it. We get to feel about Trickster however we want or need to feel about it. And we do good by ourselves to express those feelings openly and honestly, and with ourselves, and to the extent that we feel safe and comfortable then with others. Sometimes Trickster was behind the events that caused the chaos and disruption in our lives, and sometimes Trickster's just sort of lying in wait in the aftermath to take advantage of our confusion after the disruption has occurred. Either way, we're not likely to feel friendly towards Trickster. What we can do is choose how we want to respond or relate to Trickster from there in a way that can set the tone for our lives moving forward. We can decide we're going to enact revenge on Trickster. We can decide that we're going to build more resentment for Trickster. Maybe we can laugh back in Trickster's face, particularly if we feel like it's laughing at us. We can choose to regard Trickster as a wisdom figure that has something important to teach us. Perhaps we can do all at once. What we cannot do is deny the presence of Trickster in our lives. We need to start creating safer spaces to tell our own Trickster stories with each other, both normalizing them and, in some sense, rescuing ourselves from the isolating effect that our own Trickster stories can have on us, particularly when we don't feel safe to share them. We need to learn how to tell and listen to those stories in a way where they are received and not rejected, and not seen as opportunities for us to fix, save, or rescue each other from our Trickster dilemmas, nor try to solve them. What would it look like if we gave ourselves permission to share more of our own Trickster stories with each other, instead of trying to solve, scold, or minimize them in some way? How might we all learn how to develop a much deeper sense of compassion, both for ourselves and for each other? How might we begin to restore ourselves, not as problems to be solved, but rather creatures who are to be loved and embraced and held for exactly who and what we are at any given moment in our lives, no matter what's going on? I often wonder as well what our world could look like if we all together learned how to balance both our inner and outer tensions without turning those tensions into warring entities that must eliminate or destroy each other. As I stated earlier, the experience of tension itself is built into the phenomenon of consciousness. And while we can acknowledge that there are certainly some tensions which need to be resolved insofar as they are symptoms of potential threats of harm that alert us to do something, to do whatever we can to keep ourselves safe and avoid the harm, not every tension we feel inside of us is designed for the purpose of inflicting grief or harm. And not every tension we feel is always meant to be resolved. As we shall see, there are some forms of tension that are designed to teach us how to begin to learn and practice the art of balance. In other words, learning how to balance tensions rather than resolving tensions. And this can help provide us with the energy that we're going to need to begin moving out of some stuck places we find ourselves in life. And if we try and jump in and resolve those tensions too quickly or at all, we might take all the energy out that we needed. We might be missing something that's important and vital for us to see or know as we're trying to figure out how to navigate our path forward. Learning how to make a distinction between different forms of internal tension, like most things, is something that takes time and practice. But again, if we are learning how to utilize that slower receptive energy that we've been talking about in previous episodes, we will learn to recognize those distinctions because we are making more room within ourselves to see and hear from our own shadowy parts and stories. Remember that many of our own internal tensions are being produced by this clash between our ego selves and our shadow selves. The parts of us that are designed to maintain homeostasis and the parts that are meant to disrupt that. As we learn more about the relational nature of our own individual psyches, we begin to notice that some forms of internal teamwork begin to appear to us as vital and necessary and potentially helpful. The presence of certain opposites within us, while certainly provoking tension, appear also to suggest that each part of our personality works best in tandem with other parts that can provide a balancing act to what it does. And this reveals to us that every strength, for instance, that we can identify within ourselves has its shadow side that we need to be aware of and know how to navigate well. And we do this best when we can pair different parts of ourselves that provide an opposite balancing function. That might be necessary to kind of take over and assert itself in situations where our trusted and true strengths don't fit and can't have an impact, or just aren't appropriate to the situation itself. And here we learn that the breadth and complexity of our lives requires us to develop different skills for different purposes, different tools that can respond to different circumstances in our lives. I'll give an example. Part of why I became a therapist is because I have a very high capacity for empathy, meaning that my veil is thin between the experience of my own emotions and the experience of other people's emotions, particularly that are close to me in a room. Now, this gives me a lot of advantages as a therapist to more or less accurately name what's emotionally going on for a client that I'm working with. This skill serves me well in terms of partnering with my clients and helping them find the best road forward to find the healing that they're looking for. It's a wonderful strength and tool that I have, and I do my best to take good care of it. The shadow side of a high empathy person is that, unchecked, we have a tendency to take on that classic savior complex, where we believe it becomes our responsibility to rescue other people from their own difficult emotions. So my high empathy persona needs a good partner to provide a good balancing act to it. A part of me that knows how to be a little bit more detached, objective, and protective, not just of my own boundaries, but the boundaries of others, particularly the clients that I'm working with. And internal tension can be produced when we are overusing or only using one of our skills or strengths. Not only are we then misusing them, we're draining them of all of their energy so that there's very little left. If we have no knowledge of other parts of us with different gifts to bring, we won't be able to make the necessary adjustments. We'll stay stuck in that proverbial hammer to which everything looks like a nail. So this is the dilemma of opposites. And here I want to make an important distinction between the idea of opposites and opposition. Opposition implies an antagonistic or adversarial relationship in which one side is meant to beat or win out or eliminate the other. Opposites, however, are not meant to be at war with each other, but to provide that balancing act, that good relational balancing act, that know how to utilize the tension of conflict for the purpose of practicing a helpful, nurturing storyline that can move forward and not stay stuck. We learn to accept and balance important opposites by first teaching ourselves how we can be curious about them. to ask ourselves what is it that is important for us to learn about both sides of the tension, and how each of them can learn to not only complement each other, but also to dialogue with each other, and even learn how to get into and out of conflict with each other in healthy ways. Without an ability to get curious and stay curious, it becomes difficult for us to know how to pay closer attention to the different parts of us that are trying to assert themselves, as well as how these different parts of us are interacting with each other, clashing with each other, getting along or not getting along with each other. The default conflict for those parts of ourselves that we choose to ignore or deny will always be war, and we need to know that. And as we've already learned, being at war with ourselves is what keeps us stuck in our lives somewhere. Whatever we're going to war with is what we're going to get stuck to and what's going to get stuck to us. It is only with our consent and conscious participation in working dialogue with the many different parts of us that we get to teach them the art of healthy conflict, relationship, dialogue, and reciprocity. Without an ability to acknowledge and work with these different parts of ourselves, again, we'll continue to feel stuck in the old stories that we'd rather not be telling or living anymore. Unable to meaningfully build in and read new, truer stories that are waiting to be born. We need the different parts of us that work for internal balance and homeostasis. We need both. And we must learn how to create some space for disruption within ourselves, when disruption might be necessary for us to move our lives forward and grow. This is the ongoing balancing act that provides the right kind of tensions we need to experience in order to heal, in order to move, in order to transform, which then allows old and untrue stories about ourselves to be able to die and to be let go of when it is time for us to do so, and then to create space for new, better stories to grow and to emerge and take root within us in a way that helps us move forward with our lives rather than holding us back. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that we live every moment of our waking lives painfully aware and feeling and tending to these tensions within us. Most of us don't have the luxury of doing that even if we wanted to. It's not about that. It's more about taking note of tensions when we do feel them and not dismissing them, noticing them. And then when it's appropriate, carving out some time for ourselves, when we have it, to listen to them, to pay closer attention to them, to learn something about whatever it is that they want us to see. And then, again, make room, hold space to adapt slowly but surely. To end our time together, I'd like to propose a question or series of questions. What would it look like if we had more restorative communities around us who knew how to teach us to navigate difficult moments of transition, disruption, and important tensions we experience in our lives, rather than to avoid them, save us from them, or even scold us for having them, as though these are evidence of something that we are doing wrong in our lives? What if instead of teaching us how to deny and belittle these difficult moments, we instead normalized them as part of the healing and growth process, and instead offered affirmation and encouragement, holding space for each other when one or more of us particularly is struggling? What if we made it more normal to share our stories with each other instead of feeling like we need to hide them from each other, which really leads us to then hide them from ourselves? Think about how different our world could be if we all learned how to do that. These tensions we feel between powerful opposites within us are pointing towards change, and while our investigation of them does not necessarily produce a clear, direct or a clear direction or clear answers. What it does teach us how to do is to ask better questions. And we are all continuously being formed in the question that wants to be asked, not the presumptive answer that we may have projected forward and wanted jumped towards too quickly. The second we think we've got it, whatever it is, maybe some form of mastery, expertise, knowledge, gravitas, clout, but most especially certainty. That is the precise moment when Trickster comes out to play. And what we do with Trickster from there again is entirely up to us. In the next and final episode of this 6-part introductory series, we're going to explore together this idea of wholeness and what that actually is, and what it's actually pointing us towards in terms of our own ongoing journeys and growth. And the gifts we're meant to discover for ourselves that belong to us and have always belonged to us. So I look forward to meeting all of you once more in that last installment of the series. As always, take good care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you next time.